Welcome to another episode of the EmberMap podcast. I'm Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And today we're joined by special guest Jen Weber. Hi, Jen.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Why don't you go ahead and tell everyone kind of who you are and just a little bit about how you got into Ember and just introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Jen Weber. I work at a little startup called BioBright that builds applications for scientific research. And I got involved with Ember because this startup had chosen Ember for their front-end framework. And I learned Ember as part of my coding bootcamp training. So between that and a scientific research background, it was a pretty good fit. It became a little bit more than just a tool that I use for me and my participation when I started having some problems doing an upgrade from 1.13 to Ember 2, and I was following instructions that somebody else had put on a blog post that were not incorrect, but they were incomplete. And this was a link that had been provided to me while I was still very new, and I had heard that the Ember Slack was a good place to get help. And after I got help, I was just really amazed at how much everybody helps each other out, and so I started sticking around and trying to do the same. And that was about 2 years ago, I would say.
That's awesome. Wow, I have so many questions. First is, what was the boot camp that was teaching you Ember?
It was called General Assembly. They're a national organization, or international, actually.
That's awesome. I didn't know Ember was taught at a lot of those, but it's always good to hear that, What was it like learning Ember at a boot camp? I mean, Ember is big. It's complex. It touches a lot of parts of an application. There's architecture, there's syntax. So, I would just be really interested to hear what it was like coming into it kind of with fresh eyes and how that experience was learning it in that context.
Sure. So the boot camp that I did was a full stack boot camp, and learning Ember was one of the last things that we did in that boot camp. So by that point, we sort of had a background of, understanding the roles of APIs, databases. We knew CSS, we knew HTML. And so the hardest part was just learning how all of those pieces fit together. And in some ways in Ember, you get guidance in that. It was a lot under a lot of pressure. It's learning a lot faster than I would have preferred or recommended. But ultimately, I felt like it left me with sort of a foundation of understanding the concerns that I, would have to confront if I was building an app on my own. At one point, I told one of my instructors, I was like, I can't understand why anyone would use this. Why does anyone care to do it in this way? And he said, you're going to eat those words someday. And he was totally correct. That I was approaching it from the perspective of bootcamp grad just needs to get this one page to render and this one thing to calculate, and why can't I just do it in jQuery all the time, everywhere? Looking back, it's oh, that's kind of silly, but that wasn't my perspective at the time. I was just trying to get something done. A lot of my fellow bootcamp grads went on to work in other frameworks and things, and a little while ago there was a poll about whether it was beneficial or not to learn Ember, and almost everyone said yes. So really I certainly feel that way for my experience, even if I hadn't gotten a job at a company that was already using it.
Right. That makes sense. I think it's really cool that you learned the basics and the building blocks first. So you knew what a database was, you knew what network requests were, you knew how to use CSS and HTML and even JavaScript. And you knew how you would solve a problem with jQuery or some third-party library, and then you're learning Ember at the end. And so Ember is kind of giving you some patterns to follow of things that you already know. Because I think a lot of times when people learn pretty abstract tools like Ember or even like a Ruby on Rails without knowing anything underneath, it can be really confusing because not only are you learning the abstraction, there's a lot of times you're just assumed that you know the building blocks as well. So I really like that way that they took that approach, and it seems like, even though at the beginning you were like, I know I could do this on my own, so it's frustrating to have to learn kind of the Ember way. Now, 1 or 2 years out, you have the appreciation for why things were done in that way, and even the problems that they were solving based on if you had just done it yourself.
Yeah, and it didn't take 2 years either. I would say my first project that I did out the gate, once I had my job as a developer, I was like, oh, okay, I get it now.
That's great. I mean, that's really cool to hear. And just like thinking about who I put my money on for someone who, didn't have, 5 or 10 years of experience in the front end world, but if they had a solid 3-6 months working in Ember versus working in like a bunch of low level libraries, like it's really neat to just come out the gate with that experience,
Yeah. How long was the boot camp from server rendered app all the way to the end of Ember?
Yeah. So it sort of started with a little bit of pre-work that took me about 2 weeks to do. The boot camp itself was everyday instruction, Monday through Friday for 12 weeks. And then after that period, we had support while we continued to work on our apps as portfolio pieces. Cool. So I think if I remember right, Ember came in the final 2 weeks or so. And it was something that we all learned and had the option to use for our final projects.
Interesting. So teaching people Ember, like what you know now about Ember, teaching people Ember in 2 weeks just sounds like such a hard task, like such a hard undertaking.
Yeah, we had really good instructors. Nice. They were great. Truly the hardest thing for me, it wasn't getting familiar with the API. It wasn't templating or anything like that because we had covered those things a little bit. The hardest part was just understanding which files can talk to each other. And that is something that as new employees join our company, that's one of the first conversations that we have is before I even show any code at all, I say, let's talk about the different roles that things can have in an application and what gets to talk to each other. So I define a component as some reusable piece of UI, and I say okay, every component has a template and a JavaScript file, and whatever's in the template is stuff that the JavaScript file has access to and vice versa. So, sort of establishing that really strong relationship there. And then we do the same thing with routes and then tie it in with okay, the route talks to the controller. And I put it in that term, who gets to talk to who. Services are special because if you set it up right, they can talk to almost anything. And once you have that, even if you are using the quote unquote wrong thing, maybe you're building a component when you should be using a service, you at least have an understanding of the scope, if that makes any sense.
Makes a ton of sense. I really love that.
Yeah, you're not you don't have a template, I don't know, reaching into a route,
right,
pulling stuff off. So you set up really good boundaries. That's
right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And it's just a natural way to talk about, in a modern application like an Ember app, the responsibilities and the roles. And it's all about boundaries and roles and limiting that communication at different points. So that's a really cool way to explain it. It seems like you kind of have a natural strength in teaching and explaining concepts. You have a knack for it and you have a passion for it. So how long did it take you to go from kind of the end of the boot camp where you're in learner mode, Octane 10, to basically, going down this path where you read a blog post that was out of date and then basically becoming a contributor to the point where, today we see you very active and, you're a huge, valuable resource to the community, jumped on the learning team and everything you do today in such a short time. So I'm just curious because I think a lot of folks will run into a situation like the one you described where you see something out of date and it's easy to get angry, it's easy to feel resentful or frustrated that maybe someone's steering you not in quite the right direction or just the fact that this resource is out of date and it exists. and for you to just take that as an opportunity to help and to step up. And that's just something I really admire. So I'm just curious, like, what was the turnaround time there? And yeah, just talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I think at the time that I was experiencing trouble with upgrades and really kind of saw how the community operated and how open source really works, I lurked for a really long time because, like a lot of people who are learning something new, I didn't really have the confidence to feel like I was somebody who could jump in and help with that at all. Like, I saw everyone as like these experts, and I would need to become an expert first. So I kind of just like hung out on the Slack channels a little bit, and every once in a while, if someone asked a question that I would think like, ooh, that sounds like a thing that I would need to know, sometimes I would attempt to pre-research it before waiting for other people to chime in with the right answer. And then I'd see like, oh, is that, how far off was I? What kinds of things was I looking at, to kind of calibrate on how to do that problem solving. At the time, I was working completely alone on the front end. Okay, not completely alone. I was the one who was mostly responsible. Like, I had people I could go ask for help, but the point at which I knew Ember the best is a point that I reached very quickly. So they could give general, strong developer skills type support, but not anything Ember specific. And after a while, I started thinking like, okay, sometimes I'm right. Maybe I can chime in and help. And I think I did that for about, 6 months or so, maybe. And I started going to meetups. And one thing that was a big catalyst for me was meeting some of the core team members at a meetup, and Ed suggesting that I submit a proposal for EmberConf. So that was the 2017 EmberConf. And I was like, no. Why? Like, really? That's a thing that's useful? And he's like, yes. So, Ed was maybe one of the first people who taught me that my idea of where the bar was for contributing and teaching and, coding, that my imaginary bar was like way too high.
Right. That's
and
great.
then actually it is good to have participation and help from anybody at almost any level. And as a new developer, like, I didn't hold that as a value necessarily. Like, no one had ever taught me that. No one had ever sort of suggested it before. And that made a big difference to me. So really after EmberConf is when I started doing more active blogging and, making some pull requests here and there. And then around, I think, September of this past year was when I joined the learning team. Is that right? Am I a year off? No.
September of 2017?
Yeah, that was last year.
Cool. So before EmberConf this year, for sure. Mm-hmm. But after last year's EmberConf.
Yep.
Awesome. That's really interesting. I know there's been a lot of talk lately about Slack and Stack Overflow and our Discourse forums. Sounds like you had generally a pretty positive experience as a beginner in Slack because you were able to connect with people. And I guess that's one thing that Slack does offer, a kind of a benefit of Slack, that you feel like you get to connect with people more quickly maybe than you would in like an asynchronous Stack Overflow or Discourse type context. But you've been doing some work lately on Stack Overflow, cleaning up old issues, and so I was just going to ask kind of what are your thoughts there? What do you like about the current arrangement that the Ember community has and uses between Slack and Stack Overflow and Discourse? What would you like to change, or how would you like to see it change?
Oh, that's a great question. So I do definitely agree that having some sort of chat is really important. It was important to me, and I've seen a pattern before where every once in a while, I'll help somebody out who comes by the learning channel or asks some, beginner questions on the help channel, and I'll see them later join the learning team channel. I'll see them later ping me to say, hey, what can I help out with? And I think that that's a really common story, honestly, is somebody makes a human connection, whether like online or at a conference or something like that, and it kind of grows to being something a little bit more to them. Stack Overflow is really important because I think that it widens the net of people who can benefit from information sharing. And so I think of it as sort of like the depth of the interaction is a lot lower. The likelihood that it's going to change the way that that person codes or interacts with others, I mean, that's really low. But you can have a small improvement across a much wider audience. And so I kind of like to think of it in terms of that. Like there's different kinds of impact. There's helping a lot of people a little bit, and then there's helping one person a lot, and everything that goes in between. And really, I find that both ends of that spectrum can be rewarding, and I like to participate in both sides of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really interesting, because I remember when in like the earlier days of Ember, there was like this talk of building a mailing list, and there was a lot of pushback, and sort of like the community answer. I think I remember Yehuda saying this was like, get everyone on Stack Overflow because it's going to be so much more accessible than a mailing list. People will be able to search and find answers. And I remember there were a lot of Ember answers on Stack Overflow, and then I think it dipped, Slack took over, and it feels like there's now this pushback to get back there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that to a certain extent, some ebbs and flows are natural. It's not creating long-lasting Q&A is not also only about Stack Overflow. I mean, I felt that when I was using Stack Overflow, I was like, aha, I can see why this is not a thing for everybody. Like, I'm not sure if it's a thing for me that like energizes me to participate in. Whereas I may not have those same sort of reservations about, say, the forums or Slack. But like, regardless, I think it's important that there's sort of a multiplicity of different ways that people can get information. So it really depends. It's tough to build momentum on Stack Overflow when there's sort of like a low-ish volume, but I have seen some really amazing answers come across in the past couple months that they're almost like blog posts themselves. And just having that sort of thing out there is really important, and encouraging people who are across those platforms and saying like, hey, thank you so much, that's really great. That is what's going to build up the interaction. I don't see it as taking away from one thing or another. I see it as an additive thing.
Right, because there might be people answering there who aren't in Slack and will never be in Slack for a variety of reasons. Maybe their company doesn't allow it, or they just don't use Slack, or, we sit in Slack all day, but not everyone does, for sure.
There's people that do Ember that only do it for 2 hours a week.
Right.
And so they're not going to be involved as we are. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Exactly.
So yeah, just coming back to kind of how eagerly you were able to be about getting involved in the community, and as like I have a few open source libraries, and when someone just kind of comes in, you really notice the difference between the people who, the most helpful kind of person is someone who just come in and just get work done, and I just feel like you're that kind of person. So just wondering if you had any like advice. And you kind of touched on this already, like realizing the bar is lower than you probably are making it in your head. But like, what are some tips or some advice that you'd give folks who are wanting to help out, or even ways you would encourage people who aren't thinking of themselves as contributors to become contributors? Because at the end of the day, Ember is open source and all voluntary. And, I think a lot of times people look at folks like you who are public and doing work and think of themselves as very different. But in reality, we're all pretty similar in a lot of these aspects. So,
So for me, one of the reasons why I got involved was because I really reflected on what my goals were, and looked for places that helped me meet those goals. And a lot of people kind of come into open source thinking like, I want to help out because I have this sense of like, it's something that I've gotten so much out of and I want to give back. And like that's like a really great motivation. That's a good place to start from. But ultimately what's best is we can get to a place where you're benefiting too. So it's not just like, let me help out with this thing I want to give, but where are those things where it's give and get? So I jumped into some like pretty difficult infrastructure problems based on my skill set at the time, because I wanted to build out that like I'm a full stack developer kind of thing. I got involved in like deployments and releases because I wanted to be ready for when I had to do a release on the job and I had clients waiting for me. And to do that in open source with like the safety net of all these other awesome, knowledgeable people to review my stuff, that was great. So if someone is thinking about contributing, I'd suggest that they reflect on what their goals are and then ping somebody about those things. It does take a little bit of time to get oriented in an open source project, with the exception of like some, really straightforward add-ons and things. Like it really helps to have a human guide if you can find someone to do that. And sometimes all it takes is like a 10-minute conversation to overcome that first bar of like, okay, what's something that is not too far off from my current level so that I can feel successful, and that aligns with the things that I want to do. And, I think it's good to have someone give you guidance on the first couple. Then once you've got those first couple down, that's where it sort of unlocks that mode where you can just like, pop into any repository, take a look around and be like, okay, I think I know what's going on here. Let me just make an issue for it. And it kind of goes from there. But having a guide for those first couple of steps is really valuable. That's
so great. And like, yeah, it turns out maintainers will be happy to talk to folks who are offering their effort and their labor and their time to help out. So I'm sure those first couple calls were easy, right? I mean, and folks in Ember tend to be really nice. And so what did you just ping them on Slack or on GitHub?
Yeah, or sometimes they would ping me, like Locks would send me the occasional request to like write a deprecation warning or something like that. And as a maintainer of some resources, truly the hardest question for me to answer is when someone just says, hey, I want to help out. What can I help out with? It's so much easier for me to answer the question if they're like, hey, I want to help out. I really love CSS and I want to do more of it. Like, cool, I can put you in touch with the right person. I can point you at the right repository because I have this mental map of the work that needs to be done. But it's almost like I need that specificity. It's like the more specific you can be, the less work it is for me to help you engage with the work that's out there. Right. Yeah, I really love everything you just said. I mean, a lot of really like level-headed, practical advice, especially from the perspective of making sure that the work you're going to put into open source, you're getting something out of it. That way you're not just going to get burned out or feel guilty or something like that. And, I definitely tell folks similar things, like who are looking to get started in their web development careers, open source careers, the stuff, when I reflect back on the stuff I learned from working in open source, I remember when I started and, Ryan had more experience and he was saying like, I typically you always say like, I just follow what happens in open source. Like if we were working at a company and we were talking about how should we tackle this deploy problem or the CSS problem, it's like, oh, let's just look at what they're doing in open source, because open source has this way of bubbling up the best practices because they have to stand all of the, the criticism, and they're battle tested across all these different use cases. So I love that.
And there's a million different open source projects all running in parallel.
Right.
So it's your company to test out a million different deployment strategies.
Right.
It'll take years.
Right.
But like in open source, it's just the best ideas are going to bubble to the top.
Yeah.
Right. So if I just love that you got right in and recognized that, because you can be a new developer and work at a company for 10 years and only know how they do things there. And you're just, you're not going to learn the same way as if you just start understanding how things are working in open source. You're going to be light years ahead. And that's just a great way to learn. And again, I love tying the work that you're putting in back into the benefit, just to make sure that's like a sustainable thing that you have going on. It's really cool. I was going to ask, so now that you have you're gotten your foot in the door, you're part of the learning team, and you're a regular contributor, and you're known among the Ember community. You're giving a talk soon at another conference, and you've done trainings, all this stuff. So now that you kind of can look back on your time in the Ember community, and I guess this is your main experience in open source is with Ember. What are some of the things that you would like to see change about your experience, or where would you like to see either your general open source involvement or specifics within the Ember community, things change in those areas maybe over the next 6 months, a year, 2 years? Like, what are some of the things that you'd want to change?
That's a good question. Not too long ago, I would have said like, oh, I want more, I want a better understanding of sort of the development flow of Ember, but I think that the Ember Times has done a lot for that. So the main thing that I would wish for, or what would have wished for most of that time, now exists, which is really cool. Trying to think of like,
if folks haven't heard of
the
Ember Times, why don't you talk about that just quickly?
Yeah, sure. So the Ember Times is a weekly newsletter that was initially started by Jessica Jordan and a couple other people, and it aimed to capture the work that was being done on basically all of the various Ember code bases, so including Ember Data, Ember CLI, Ember itself, the learning team, and calling out progress as it was happening, calling out contributors as they were helping out, and really helping to paint that picture of what's going on and how does it all come together. I find it really inspiring to read, just to see, how much time and effort is going in and all of the different stages and steps that are part of building something meaningful. I mean, it's an enormous organization. It's an enormous undertaking, and like it kind of just goes, which is amazing.
Cool. So now that we have the Ember Times, what are some other things on your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that as a community, we still have some work to do on not only presenting the things that are done, the things that are ready, the things that are promises and we're so sure that it's going to happen, and instead talk more about the work as it's being done. So, the Ember Times capture some of that, but ultimately it's up to a lot of the individuals and sort of the key contributors to different projects to voice what's going on. Because I see, particularly with the Roadmap blog post series, there's a lot of people who are wondering, like, what's the status of something? Why isn't this available yet? When can I use it? Why is there this long-standing bug? And if we only ever talk about things when they're done, we're leaving people in the dark, and they don't have the opportunity to jump in. They don't see it as a thing that they should jump in on if they're so desperate to have, this or that feature. There's a lot of complex projects that aren't easy to jump in on, but overall, even if we were just saying more about their status, that could help give people some reassurance and insights. And so I'd kind of just encourage, people who are working on big things should brag about it, and not just at the time that they feel that it's done and it's perfect. So.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been on both sides of that, right? When I'm building something, I'm like, I can't show this. It's not perfect. I need to do this one more thing and then, get it done and then show it. But on the other side, it's like, if I just hear that someone's working on something in Ember, it's just like, it's almost like this anxiety gets removed. It's just so good to hear like, oh yeah, that's awesome. Like, this is what you're working on. Like,
Yep.
I'm really happy I'm involved in Ember. And
Yep.
the worst is just those like a year goes by and you're like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, definitely like over communicate is so important.
Yep. And of course, tempering that with, you don't want to promise too many things. We're painting how things are realistic, but at least mentioning like, hey, I just put in a pull request for whatever. And that's a step forward, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it's like on consulting work, right? Once you start exposing your unfinished work and exposing your process, even on a weekly basis, even if you have nothing to ship for 4 weeks, but how much better to report what was happening each week and what progress you did make. It just reassures the client so much, and it's the same thing here.
I mean, we have this saying that good news is okay, bad news is okay, but surprises are not.
Yeah.
And like that's what we want to focus on. That's what
I like that. That's a good saying.
Yep. What are you working on personally? Like, what are some of your personal projects that you're working on? Some of your favorite things that you're investing in, and yeah.
Yeah. So some of my personal projects, as far as Ember goes, at least, I am working on some new content for the CLI guides. Kind of a tutorial or sort of overview of the most common commands, and I finally made a working Ember add-on for the first time like last week. So as part of trying to write that, so I really enjoy writing, and a lot of it goes into my blog, and more I want to shift that balance to a little bit more of it, making it back into Ember's official resources, as opposed to just me sort of like guiding and facilitating that process. Like I really like that. I'm going to be giving a couple talks in the near future. So Ember Camp, which is in Chicago, coming up this fall. Really looking forward to that. I'm starting to sketch out some of that talk.
Yeah, you're giving the closing keynote there. That's in September.
Yeah.
We're definitely
in
going
the
to see you
open
there.
keynote here. So.
Do you know what you're going to talk about at Ember Camp?
Oh, so I have to run my ideas past the organizing committee first. But, I think no matter what I talk about, one of the main themes is going to be encouraging others to not set that imaginary bar so high, to not make assumptions about themselves that they wouldn't make about somebody else that they meet and somebody else's abilities and how worthy they are to help out with something. Like, we treat ourselves very harshly. So that will probably be a theme. What wrapper that takes is TBD.
Nice.
I'm also going to be presenting at another conference this upcoming fall that's not an Ember conference, and the topic for that will be applying grassroots social marketing skills that I learned in my previous lines of work into managing open source projects.
Interesting. Where is that going to be given?
It's not formally announced yet, so I'll just tell you the topic.
We'll have to keep our ears out.
I'll let them have their thunder, but
that's so neat. Well, we can't wait to see you in September in Chicago. It's going to be a good time. And, we really appreciate all the work you've done on the learning team. Kind of makes me feel lazy, to be honest. You're going to be helping out with the Ember CLI guides. That's like my number one complaint in this office.
I mean, if you want something to soothe that guilt, I can shoot you an email.
I do think, going back to your point about it being like also a personal, like a selfish thing, and not in a bad way. I always know that good writers stand out to me, and folks who contribute good documentation and writing, those people stand out, even if it's stuff that makes its way into the official docs. You find out who was the author there. You get to know people, how they communicate in GitHub issues. So just from my experience, I will say, like, if the more you do that, even if it's taking away from your personal blog and going into Ember's official resources, like, I would just say to anyone listening that is still a worthwhile investment, and it will be rewarded and people will know about it. And, you'll build that reputation, and that's just a valuable skill that not everyone has.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're not mutually exclusive either. Some of the things I sometimes do a blog post as a precursor to tackling something harder in the guides, and vice versa. If I find myself writing about something in the guides, the brevity that's required there, maybe I have a little bit more to say that belongs in the blog. And so you can kind of, if you're trying to be visible and build up a portfolio of writing, it's also not either or. It is more time, but it's still pretty valuable.
Right. What do you think is the best part about being part of the Ember community? So someone's looking to learn a new JavaScript framework today, or choose a JavaScript community to be part of. They know that they want to be in JavaScript, and they know they want to make, rich web applications and rich UIs on the internet. Why should they get involved with Ember?
So I think choices are made carefully and considerately of all of the users from a variety of different kinds of companies. And so coming back to that whole surprises are not okay piece, I think that's a pretty big deal. The RFC process that we have, the commitment to Semver, that means a lot from my perspective when it comes to technical things. And then on the flip side, for people who want to engage at a different level, if you want to be part of an open source community, there's the smartest, kindest people who are involved. And, I'm sure that's true for other frameworks too, but it's just, if anyone talks to me for a minute, they're going to learn that that's something that's really important to me. And I would not trade that for anything else.
That's awesome. Jen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. If folks want to follow your public speaking career, or your writing career, or your work on Twitter or GitHub, where should they follow you on the internet?
Twitter is the easiest because it's the funnel for all of those things. So it's JWWWEBER, last name's Weber.
Do you have two middle names that start with W, or is that like a World Wide Web thing?
Oh, it's totally an internet pun.
That's great. Well, thanks again for coming on the show, and we can't wait to see you in person in September in Chicago.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone, and we'll see you next week.